Natchez Trace Parkway in Tennessee, Alabama, and Mississippi. Hi, this is Jim from RV4x40.com. Welcome to the channel today. We're going to take a quick trip down the Natchez Trace Parkway. It starts up near Nashville and goes all the way to Natchez, Mississippi, traveling down through Tennessee, then Alabama, then of course into Mississippi. And first thing I had to find out was, why is this called a trace? For a trail or a road, that made no sense to me. But in researching this, I found out that the trace comes from the fact that the Indians followed animal traces, or animal trails if you will, when they were making their trails through this part of the wilderness. And they think that this particular trace or trail goes back several thousand years, when the buffalo were down along the Mississippi Valley, and they would traverse up to near Nashville to get salt licks. And so these big animals could break a trail through the brush and through the woods and whatever the underbrush was. So the Indians, when they came along, would follow those same trails, and eventually this trail became really a trading route for the Native Americans before Europeans came into the country. So when Thomas Jefferson was the president, and before the Louisiana Purchase was even made, there was concern about getting control of what were then called the Southwest Territories. That was Alabama and Mississippi, was considered the West and the South in that time frame. So in 1801, a treaty was negotiated with the Chickasaw and Choctaw Indians, who occupied this part of the present-day U.S. in that time period. This was even before the Louisiana Purchase was made. But Jefferson was concerned about getting settlers into and commerce into that part of the continent because of the claims of the Spanish and the French in that territory as well. So he wanted the road opened up. They negotiated the treaty with the Indians, and the Army came in and started improving the trail so it could pass wagons in both directions, up and down. In that time period, before steamboats, most of the traffic on the Mississippi River was going downriver from Pittsburgh and other places on the Ohio River, all the way down, because they could go in that direction fairly easily with boats built out of wood. But when they got down there, because of the current in Mississippi, it was impractical to bring the boats back upriver to reload them and ship them down again. So the cargo was sold and the boats were sold for their lumber. So at that point, the crews had to get back up to the northern part of the country, and they would take the Natchez Trace up some 440 miles to get to Nashville, and there was another road there that went further east. So that was the original traffic on it. The trace was actually only used from about 1805, 1806, that time frame when they got improved enough to run carts down it, until about 1830. And the reason for it was a couple of things, one of which there were other roads built that were shorter traffic to the Mississippi. Also, the steamboat came into being, and the steamboats could now churn up the river as well as go down it. So it eliminated the need for people to go back up the river, and boats became more reusable. And so the whole commerce changed. So for about 30 years, the Natchez Trace was a major road, major highway. It figures prominently in the War of 1812 with Andrew Jackson's troops going down the road. I'm not sure if he ever did or not, but his troops certainly went down the road to get to New Orleans. And another very famous incident occurred on the Natchez Trail. And if you remember Meriwether Lewis from the Lewis and Clark expedition, he had become the governor of the Louisiana Territory, and appointed by Jefferson, I believe. But he was going back east, a couple of different versions of the story. One, to work on his memoirs and get those published. The other, which he had fronted some expenses out of his own pocket and was having trouble getting reimbursed by the federal government. So he was on his way either to Washington or Philadelphia, depending on the story. And along the Natchez Trace, on one particular evening, he was actually killed. It's unclear to this day if he was murdered or if he committed suicide. He was apparently suicidal and attempted that before, but also there were some suspicious circumstances. He was carrying a fair amount of money at that time, so no one knows, and it's unclear. He's buried along the trail. We'll show you a site of his burial site. But they attempted to exhume the body once upon a time, but the National Park Service refused to give permission to dig his grave up and examine the body for forensic evidence, because there are a number of other graves in the area and would have meant disturbing other graves, and they didn't feel the settling a controversy over how someone died in 1811 or whatever it was worth the effort to tear the cemetery apart. So that occurred. We're going to show you a lot of things along the way. Some of the things we saw, we missed a lot. Our trip was, because our RV with the Jeep exceeds the legal towing length on the parkway, it's 50 feet. And so we would actually take the RV down, starting on the northern end of it. It went down roughly a third of the way, stayed in, not even that part, close to the top. So we started with the RV, went down a little bit on the trace and stayed in a Tennessee state park. And then we take the Jeep over, drive up and down the parkway, see the sights. The next day we moved a little further down, spent 2 nights at each of these sites, spent a day sightseeing, and then the next day we'd move on to the next. So we stopped at 3 different places, so you'll see some of the highlights along 3 different sections. It is a beautiful drive, a very scenic, very relaxing place to drive. The parkway does not follow the exact trail of the trace. It parallels it in most cases, but there are several places you can see the original trace, and we'll show you pictures of that as we go along. So we hope you enjoyed this trip, and we'll see you at the end. And here we go. We are in Tennessee. This is late January of 2021. So in spite of all the COVID things, we are out and about and trying to socially distance and wear our mask and all the other things. We have both had our first shot in the series. We'll be getting a second shot in a little less than 3 weeks. But in the meantime, we're exploring some things even though it's January.
Yes, we are parked by a beautiful lake and really looking forward to seeing more of the area around here.
Yep, we have not spent much time in this part of Tennessee, traveled through it a lot, but not spent a great deal of time here. And so we're going to go explore the Natchez Trace because of the restrictions on the parkway. Actually, Natchez Trace Parkway is a correct phrase. But the restrictions on that road are no longer than a combined length of 50 feet, and we are about 65 feet with the RV and the Jeep. So we're parked in a state park right now. We're here a couple of days, and we're going to wander down the parkway in car as we can see some things, and so we'll try and bring you some information about that. Don't expect it to be a great time for pictures. First of all, it's overcast. Second of all, it's the middle of winter, so the trees are bare and other things, but few people out and around. So we'll be back later and give you some information as to what we find and how things go. In the early 1800s, many thoughtful Americans believed that isolation and the difficulties of communication would force the Mississippi Valley settlement to form a separate nation. Hoping to hold the frontier, Congress in 1800 established a postal route from Nashville to Natchez. The trace, and then a series of Indian trails, had drawn from the Secretary of State the bitter comment, "The passage of mail from Natchez is as tedious as from Europe, wherein westerly winds prevail." To speed the mail, President Jefferson ordered the Army to clear out the trail and make it a road. Post riders carrying letters, dispatches, and newspapers helped bind the vast turbulent frontier to the Republic. However, their day passed by the mid-1830s when steamboats running from New Orleans to Pittsburgh robbed the trace of its usefulness as a main post road. Preserved here is a portion of a nearly 200-year-old road, the old Natchez Trace. Maintaining this 500-mile-long wilderness road in the early 1800s was a difficult, if not hopeless, task. As you look down the sunken trench, note the large trees growing on the edge of the 10-foot wide strip we clear today. These trees are mute testimony to the endless struggle between man to alter and change, and nature to reclaim, restore, and heal. One of the few remaining buildings associated with the old Natchez Trace is the house of ferry operator John Gordon. In the early 1800s, Gordon made an agreement with the Chickasaw chief George Colbert to operate a trading post and ferry on the Duck River. Military expeditions with General Andrew Jackson kept him away from home much of the time. His wife Dorothea supervised the construction of the present house in 1817 and 18. John Gordon died shortly after it was completed, but Mrs. Gordon lived here until her death in 1859. Tobacco farm. You see here a typical early 1900 tobacco farm. A 10-minute loop walk takes you through the field and to the barn where you see tobacco hanging to dry. Old Trace. From here you may drive north on a narrow 2-mile section of the original old Natchez Trace and meet the parkway at the other end. Your slower pace may take you back to the time and let you enjoy the views of the valley below. One of the things about the Trace was it generally followed ridge lines. It kept up out of the valleys which were prone to flooding and being wet, but the ridge lines would be drier most of the year.
So it's been an interesting afternoon looking at all the sites along the Natchez Trace Parkway.
It's been fun. We have covered, I don't know, about maybe 60 miles from the time we got on the parkway. Not a huge amount of it, but what we could get done in an afternoon. And the weather has not been particularly cooperative, but it's been a good day. Haven't had any active rain. And so we decided we've done enough, and we've got an hour and a half or so back to the campground. So we're going to head in that direction, and then we'll be getting ready to move tomorrow and head on further on down parallel to the trace as we get further south.
Yeah, we're looking forward to that as well.
We are in Starkville, Mississippi on our second day of actually exploring the Natchez Trace, and we're getting ready to head out this morning from Starkville, go north a bit, and then back down south on the trace to see what's in this section of the middle part of the trace, and hopefully we'll find some more things to show you guys.
Yeah, we had a good time the other day in the upper area, and the Trail of Tears was particularly interesting to me, and so I'm looking forward to what we learned today.
Yes, we could have spent a lot more time through here, and we may well be back at some point, probably more in the spring or summer or even fall would be a pretty time of the year up through Tennessee, but we happen to be here in January, so that's what we're doing. This marker is for the grave of Meriwether Lewis. He was the Lewis of the Lewis and Clark expedition, famed for his exploration of the Louisiana Purchase under President Jefferson. He died in 1809 near this spot and was buried here. He died in the Grinder House, and it's unknown for sure whether he was murdered or whether he actually committed suicide. He was shot to death with multiple wounds, so it is totally unclear. He had a history of attempted suicide, but the case was never totally closed. Before you is the second largest temple mound in the United States. Only Monk's Mound in Chicoya, Illinois is larger. This 8-acre mound, constructed from a natural hill, was built and used from about 1300 to 1600 by the Mississippians, ancestors of the Natchez Indians. Unlike dome-shaped mounds constructed only for burials, emerald mounds supported temples, ceremonial structures, and burials of a complex society, civic, and religious leaders. Covering roughly 8 acres, Emerald Mound is the second largest Mississippian mound north of Mexico. The main platform was constructed in 3 stages beginning circa AD 1350. Archaeological excavations have confirmed that the first and second stages had at least 2 secondary mounds with buildings on their summits. During the final stage of mound construction, the secondary mounds at either end were enlarged, and at least 6 additional mounds were constructed along the perimeter of the platform. Well, we're ready to start day 3 of our exploration of the Natchez Trace, the parkway itself, which parallels the old Natchez Trace route and runs on it a little bit, but mostly runs through the same general territory. And we've been traveling one day and then spending a day in a spot to do some looking around. We started on the Nashville end, and we're down at Natchez. And this will be our last day of exploration, a few things we want to see down here. What do you think so far, Chris?
Well, it's been a really educational and fun experience, in spite of it being January and the trees with no leaves. We had a wonderful dinner last night right on the Mississippi River, so we were pleased to be able to do that here in Natchez. And we're camped in a beautiful site in the Natchez State Park.
Yep, it's been fun. We've had a good time, and then tomorrow we'll start heading back to Georgetown, Texas, to be there for a few weeks before we start traveling again. So we'll let you know how this day goes, but we're looking forward to it. There is an awful lot of history here that's just hard to describe, and a little bit of different conflicts. Inns along the trace. Mount Locust remains as the only one of more than 50 inns that existed between 1785 and 1830 along the 500-mile-old trace. It has been restored to its 1810 appearance, the time when travel on this historic road reached its peak. Preserved here is a portion of the deeply eroded or sunken old trace. Hardships of journeying on the old trace included heat, mosquitoes, poor food, hard beds, if any, disease, swollen rivers, and sucking swamps. Take 5 minutes to walk this sunken trail and let your imagination carry you back to the early 1800s when people walking 500 miles had to put up with these discomforts and where a broken leg or arm could spell death for the lone traveler. This is a view looking from the edge down into the trace. This is a deeply eroded section of the trace. For whatever reason, the trail comes down one way, makes an almost U-turn, and goes back the other way, and continues on down the trail. You can see how deep the rut is here. My estimate was about 18 to 20 feet deep from the surrounding hillsides. This is another side looking back down into the trace. It's hard to imagine that people and horses and oxen and mules and donkeys and whatever else could cut a trace this deep into the earth, but that's what happened in the old Natchez Trace. That's our trip down the Natchez Trace Parkway. We hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned some things about it. One of the things I would like to point out is we are bringing up a website that's going to give you access to some of the pictures we use in these videos. So if you've seen one you like, we'll post a link to that down in the description. You can go over to PicFair and look at our photos and see if there's something you like. We're also working on being able to custom crop pictures. We can do that, just get the information out there. But if you have an odd-sized picture frame, which our RV has several of them, and we'll show a video of that here in the next week or two. Anyway, we did some pictures that I had taken, had them sized to fit in the existing picture frames with the existing matting, and we can do that if someone wants some of our pictures, or if you want that done for a picture of your own, if you want it done for a picture you get somewhere else, we can talk about all that. So We hope you're having a great day. We hope you enjoyed the video. If you like it, give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed, please consider subscribing to it. We'd appreciate that. And we'll see you on the next video.